The coffin was empty. He stood at the edge of the open grave, lantern in hand, mud soaking through his boots and the rain hammering against his shoulders, almost biblical in its fury. And he stared at the pale silk lining of a coffin that held nothing. No body, no bones, no remains of the girl he had mourned for 6 years, just roses. Dead, blackened roses pressed flat against satin, their petals crumbling into dust at the first touch of air. "Your Grace!" Pharaoh's voice behind him was barely audible above the storm. "Your Grace, the coffin is empty." The word came out quiet, controlled, quiet enough to make men step back. "The coffin is empty." And Rawdon Voss, the Duke of Beaumont, who had not raised his voice since the funeral, who had not wept since the day they lowered this box into the ground, who had carried a blank dance card in his breast pocket every day since the spring of 1841. He began to shake, not with grief, not any more, with rage. Welcome to Aristocratic Hearts. You know, there are some stories that stay with you long after they end. Stories that make you set down whatever you are doing and just sit with the weight of them for a moment. This is one of those stories. Before we begin, I want to hear from you. Where in the world are you listening from right now? What time is it where you are? Whether it is the middle of the night and you cannot sleep, or you are settling in with a cup of tea, drop your city and your time in the comments. I read every one, and knowing that you are out there makes this feel like we are in this together. Tonight's story is about a girl who was buried alive. Not in the ground, though they put a coffin there with her name on it, and her aunt wept beautifully over it, and all of London believed every tear. No. She was buried in something worse, a place where no one could hear her scream, a place where they called her by a different name and told her she was mad when she insisted she was not. She was 19 years old when they took her. She was 25 when he found her, and the man who found her, the Duke of Beaumont, the most powerful and the most solitary man in England, had been carrying a piece of her with him all that time without knowing she was still alive. What happened when he opened that coffin and found it empty, what he did next, is a story about obsession, about fury, about the kind of love that does not ask permission. Let me take you back to the spring of 1841, to a ballroom in London, to the night that started everything. The ballroom at Almack's was hot, that suffocating, airless heat that came from 600 candles burning in crystal chandeliers above 300 bodies pressed into a room designed for 200. The smell of beeswax mixed with rosewater, with perspiration discreetly blotted by silk handkerchiefs, with the faint, metallic edge of the rain that had been falling since morning and showed no sign of stopping. Nell Ashcroft stood against the far wall, between an arrangement of hothouse roses and a pillar that had been decorated with trailing ivy for the occasion, and she watched the dancing without expression. She was 18 years old. She wore a dress that had been her mother's, white muslin with a high collar, no embroidery, no lace at the hem, nothing that would catch the light or draw the eye. Her dark hair was pinned simply. She wore no jewels. Her gloves were clean, but not new. She had been standing in this exact spot for 2 hours. No one had asked her to dance. This was not unusual. Nell had attended 4 events in the 3 weeks since she had arrived in London for her first season, and at each one the result had been the same. She arrived. She stood. She watched. She left. Her aunt, Mrs. Moira Hadwell, always seemed to find a reason to position Nell in the least visible corner of whatever room they occupied, always managed to steer conversations away from her when introductions might have been made, always smiled her tight, brittle smile and said things like, "My niece is quite shy, I'm afraid. She takes after her poor mother. Not much to say for herself." It was not true. Nell had a great deal to say for herself. She had opinions about the corn laws. She could read Latin. She had managed her father's, household accounts since she was 14, and had caught the steward skimming twice. She knew the names of every tenant on her father's estate and the ages of their children. But her aunt never introduced her to anyone who might discover this. Her aunt introduced her to no one at all. Across the ballroom, on the far side of the dance floor, a man stood watching her. He was tall. That was the first thing anyone noticed about the Duke of Beaumont, his height and the way he used it, standing absolutely still while the crowd moved and shifted around him the way water parts around stone. He was 28 years old, dark-haired, sharp-featured, with grey eyes that held an expression most people found difficult to read and some people found difficult to meet. He had arrived 20 minutes ago. He had not danced. He had not spoken to anyone beyond the bare requirements of courtesy. He was holding a glass of champagne he had not tasted, and he was watching the girl by the pillar, with an attention so complete that his friend Lord Ashton had twice tried to speak to him and twice been ignored. "Beaumont," Ashton touched his arm, "you are staring." "Yes." "At whom?" The Duke said nothing. His eyes stayed fixed on the girl in the white dress. "I don't know her," Ashton said, following his gaze. "She's been there all evening. No one's spoken to her. I assumed she was a companion or a chaperone, but she's too young for—" "Her name is Ashcroft." The Duke's voice was low, measured. "Miss Petronella Ashcroft. Her father was Sir Gerard Ashcroft of Harrowfield in Devonshire. He died in February. She is here with her aunt, Mrs. Hadwell, who is her guardian." Ashton stared at him. "How on earth do you know all that?" "I asked." "You asked? When?" "When she arrived." That had been 2 hours ago. Ashton looked from the Duke to the girl and back again, and something in the Duke's expression, something still and focused and utterly unguarded, made him fall silent. He had known the Duke of Beaumont for 15 years. He had never seen him look at anyone like that. "Go and speak to her," Ashton said quietly. "Not yet." "Why?" The Duke offered no answer. He was watching the way the candlelight caught the side of her face, the way she held herself, straight-backed, chin level, refusing to fold inward even though she was alone and must have known it. There was no self-pity in her posture, no shrinking. She stood like someone who had decided that if the world was going to ignore her, she would observe it with a clear eye and a steady heart, and she would not apologize for taking up space. He set down his glass. He took one step forward, and then another. He was crossing the room before he had decided to cross the room, something he would later recognize as unprecedented. The Duke of Beaumont never moved without intention, never acted without calculation, and yet here he was, cutting through the crowd toward a girl he had never met because something in his chest had simply overruled his mind. He was 10 feet from her when it happened. A passing couple, deep in conversation, collided with the rose arrangement beside her. The vase tipped. Nell caught it. Quick, instinctive, one hand on the crystal, the other steadying the flowers. And in doing so, she stepped sideways and directly into his path. They were suddenly very close, close enough that he could see the tiny crease between her brows where she was concentrating on the vase, close enough that when she looked up she had to tilt her chin to meet his eyes. "Forgive me," she said. "The roses were about to—" She stopped. She looked at him, at his height, at his stillness, at whatever it was in his expression that had made Ashton fall silent. "I beg your pardon, sir. The fault is entirely with the roses." His voice came out steady. The rest of him was anything but. "May I?" He took the vase from her hands and set it back on the pedestal. There, fingers touched, his bare, hers gloved, and the contact lasted perhaps half a second, and he felt it in his spine. "Thank you," she said, and then, because she was Nell and could not help herself, "They have been overwatering them. The stems are weak. That is why they tipped. He looked at her. At this girl in a plain white dress who had been ignored all evening and whose first observation to a stranger was about the structural integrity of rose stems. "You know about roses," he said. "My father grew them. A flicker of something, grief, raw and recent, crossed her face. She caught it, steadied it. "He would have been appalled by the arrangement. The damasks are crowded. They need space to breathe." "Like some people at this ball." Her gaze sharpened. And then, in one unguarded flash, she almost smiled. Not a polite smile, a real one. Surprised, involuntary, quickly suppressed, but not quickly enough. "Yes," she said, "like some people." And at that precise moment, a woman appeared at Nell's side. A woman in dark purple silk with a face porcelain smooth, perfectly painted and perfectly cold, and took her arm with a grip that was too tight to be gentle. "We are leaving," the woman said. "The carriage is waiting." "But Aunt Moira, the dancing has only just—" "Now, Petronella." The girl's mouth closed. Something flickered behind her eyes. Not submission, the Duke noted, but calculation. She was choosing her battles. She allowed her aunt to steer her toward the door, and as she turned, her gaze swept the room one final time. It landed on him. For perhaps 3 seconds, no more, their eyes met across 60 feet of crowded ballroom. She neither smiled nor looked away. She looked at him the way one looks at something unexpected, something that does not fit the pattern of an otherwise predictable evening. Then her aunt pulled her through the doorway, and she was gone. The Duke stood where he was, motionless. The next morning he sent a note to Mrs. Hadwell's London residence, requesting permission to call upon her niece. The reply came within the hour. Miss Ashcroft was unwell. She had returned to the country. Visitors were unwelcome. He sent another note the following week, the same reply. He sent a third 2 weeks after that. This time the reply was sharper. Miss Ashcroft's health was fragile. Further correspondence was unwelcome. He stopped writing. But he could not stop thinking about her, the girl in the white dress who stood alone in a room full of people and refused to bend. He asked his man Farrow to make discreet inquiries. Farrow reported that Miss Ashcroft had indeed returned to Devonshire and was living quietly at Harrowfield under her aunt's supervision. That she was not seen in the village. That the servants who had known her as a child had been dismissed one by one and replaced with staff loyal to Mrs. Hadwell. That the house had grown very quiet. The Duke filed this information away. He would wait. He was patient. In the drawer of his desk at Beaumont House, beside his correspondence and his seal, he kept one item with no business being there, a dance card, picked up from the floor of Almack's on the night of the ball. It was blank, every line empty, not a single name. It was hers. He was certain of it. He kept it. In Devonshire, in the great stone house called Harrowfield that had belonged to the Ashcroft family for 4 generations, Nell learned the dimensions of her new life. The dimensions were small. Her father's study, the room where she had sat on his knee as a child and listened to him read Virgil aloud, where she had helped him sort the estate accounts and argued with him about drainage improvements for the lower fields, was locked. Her aunt had taken it as her own. The library was locked. The drawing room was locked. Nell was given her old bedroom and access to the servants' corridor that led to the kitchen and the garden. Her meals were brought to her room on a tray. She was not invited to dine with her aunt and her cousin Arthur, who had arrived from London 3 days after the funeral with gambling debts so large that he had aged 10 years in the settling of them. Arthur was 26, soft-faced, weak-chinned, with the watery eyes of a man who had spent too many nights drinking and too few mornings facing consequences. He looked at Nell the way one might look at a piece of furniture that was inconveniently placed, with mild irritation and the assumption that someone else would move it. "How long is she staying?" she heard him ask his mother through the wall one evening. "She lives here, Arthur. It is technically her house." "Technically? Until she is." 25. Then the trust dissolves and the estate passes to her in full, unless, of course, something were to happen before then. A pause. Then Arthur. "What do you mean, something?" "I mean that I have been thinking, darling." Very carefully. Nell pressed her ear closer to the wall, her heart hammering. But her aunt's voice dropped too low to hear, and all she caught was the clink of a glass being set down and the sound of her cousin's nervous, shallow laugh. Sleep never came. She should have run. She knew that later in the years that followed, in the long dark nights when she lay on a narrow cot, in a room that smelled of carbolic and damp stone, and listened to women weeping through the walls. She should have gone to the village, to the vicar, to anyone. But she was 18 years old, and her father was dead, and her aunt was her legal guardian, and in 1841, England, a woman without a husband or a father had very few doors she could open on her own. The law did not protect women like Nell. It consumed them. It was March of 1842, 10 months after her father's death, when the tea began to taste different. Not wrong exactly, just heavier. Nell noticed it one afternoon, a thickness in the brew, a faint bitterness beneath the bergamot that had not been there before. She set the cup down without drinking. The next morning, the tea tasted the same. She poured it into the chamber pot. By the third day, she was certain someone was putting something in her tea. And that same evening, as if in response to her quiet refusal, her aunt appeared in her doorway with a man Nell had never seen before. "This is Dr. Calvert," Aunt Moira said, her voice the same sweet poison it always was. "He is here to examine you. I am not ill. You have been behaving oddly, refusing your meals, refusing your tea. The servants are concerned." "I am not. Dr. Calvert is a specialist in nervous disorders. He has treated some of the finest families in England." Her aunt's eyes were steady, flat, measuring. "You will cooperate, Petronella, for your own good." The doctor was a thin man with spectacles and hands that smelled of camphor. He asked her questions. Did she sleep? Did she have visions? Did she hear voices that were not there? And Nell answered each one truthfully. Yes, she slept. No, she had no visions. No, she heard no voices. He wrote something in a leather notebook, angling it away from her. 2 weeks later, on a night so dark the stars themselves seemed to have withdrawn, Nell woke to hands on her arms. She tried to scream. A cloth was pressed over her mouth, thick, damp, smelling of something sweet and chemical that burned the inside of her nose and made the room tilt sideways. She fought. She kicked. Her foot connected with something solid, and she heard a grunt, but the hands held her fast, and the cloth stayed pressed against her face, and the sweetness was pouring into her lungs now, filling her head with a roaring blackness. The last thing she saw before consciousness left her was her aunt's face, framed by the door, lit by a single candle, watching. She was not smiling. She was not frowning. She wore the expression of a woman completing a task she had planned for a very long time. The funeral was held on a Tuesday. The vicar of St. Michael's Church in the village of Ashcroft spoke kindly about a young woman taken too soon by a sudden fever. Mrs. Hadwell wept into a black handkerchief edged with lace. Cousin Arthur stood beside her, looking appropriately solemn, and not at all like a man who had recently been relieved of a significant financial burden. The tenants came. The village came. They laid flowers on the coffin and murmured that it was a tragedy, that she had been so young that her poor father had barely been cold in his own grave. The coffin was made of elm. It was lined with white silk. Inside it, pressed against the lining, were roses from the garden at Harrowfield. The same roses Nell's father had planted the year she was born. There was nothing else inside. No body, no girl, no Nell. Because Nell was not dead. She was in a carriage, drugged and unconscious, travelling north on the Great North Road toward a place she had never heard of and a name she had never been given. She woke in a room utterly foreign to her. Bare walls, a narrow window set high in the wall, barely wide enough to let in light, a cot with a thin mattress, a bucket in the corner. The air smelled of lye and something older, something institutional and airless that she would later learn was the smell of hopelessness. A woman in a grey dress stood over her. "You are Mary Poole," the woman said. Her voice was flat, rehearsed. "You were brought here by your family for treatment of your delusions. You believe you are someone else. You are not. You are Mary Poole, and you are a patient at Briarstone." "My name is Petronella Ashcroft," Nell said. Her voice was raw. Her throat burned from whatever they had used to sedate her. "I am not mad. My aunt—" "Your delusions are noted." The woman wrote something on a piece of paper. "Dr. Hargrove will see you in the morning." Please listen to me. My name is—" The door closed. The lock turned, and Nell Ashcroft, who had managed her father's estate, who could read Latin, who had stood alone in a ballroom full of strangers and refused to bend, pressed her back against the rough wall and slid to the floor. The tears would come later. Crying would come later in the small hours when the building creaked, and the woman in the next room moaned, and the darkness was so complete that she could not see her own hands, for now she simply sat and thought and began to plan. Private asylums in 1840s England operated in a world almost entirely without oversight. A single doctor's signature was sufficient to commit a patient, and once committed, that patient had almost no legal means of securing their release. Women were particularly vulnerable. Inconvenient wives, disobedient daughters, women who had inherited money that their male relatives wanted, all could be, and were, consigned to these institutions on the flimsiest of medical pretexts. The Lunacy Commission existed, but its inspections were infrequent, its powers limited, and its commissioners easily satisfied by clean sheets and a warm meal served on inspection day. When Nell arrived at Briarstone, she entered a system designed to make her disappear, and for years it worked. She tried to tell them. That first week, and the week after, and the month after that, she told every nurse, every attendant, every doctor who came to check her pulse and ask her if she still believed she was someone other than Mary Poole. "My name is Petronella Ashcroft. My father was Sir Gerard Ashcroft of Harrowfield in Devonshire. He died in February of 1841. My aunt committed me here against my will. Please write to the vicar at Ashcroft. He knows me. He baptized me. He will confirm everything I am telling you." They wrote it down. They nodded, and then they gave her laudanum. By the end of the first year, she had stopped telling them. Not because she had stopped believing it. She would never stop believing it. She whispered her own name to herself every morning when she woke, a private litany against erasure. But because she had learned that the truth, repeated, was being used as evidence of her madness. Every time she said her name, they wrote, "Patient continues to exhibit delusional beliefs regarding her identity." Every time she asked them to send a letter, they wrote, "Patient grows agitated when her claims are not validated." Her sanity was being used to prove her insane. So she stopped. She became Mary Poole. She was quiet. She ate what they gave her. She walked in the small walled garden when the weather permitted. She learned which attendants were kind and which were cruel, which doctors actually listened, and which had already decided before they entered the room. She counted the days. She had been counting since she woke in this room, scratching small marks into the stone beneath her cot with a hairpin she had hidden in her hem, when the hairpin was confiscated. During a room inspection, she used her fingernail. When her fingernail wore down, she used a chip of stone from the crumbling mortar in the corner. 6 scratches to a row, 7 rows to a section. Each section was 6 weeks. She counted every single day. 2,190 days. There were moments, dark ones, silent ones, the kind that came at 3 in the morning when even the building seemed to have given up, when she considered stopping, not escape. She had tried escape, once, in the 3rd month. She had made it as far as the kitchen before 2 attendants caught her and dragged her back and strapped her wrists to the bed frame with leather restraints and left her there for 2 days. The marks had faded. The memory had not. What she considered stopping was simpler, quieter. She considered accepting that she was Mary Poole, that the life she remembered. Her father reading Virgil, the smell of the roses at Harrowfield, the weight of the household ledger. In her hands was a dream. That the attendants were right, and the doctors were right, and the grey walls and the narrow cot and the bucket in the corner were all there was and all there would ever be. But she refused to stop. And the reason was this. Every morning, in the few seconds between sleep and waking, before she opened her eyes and saw the stone walls, there was a moment where she was still herself, still Nell, still the girl who had stood in a ballroom and looked a stranger in the eye and felt something shift. And she held that moment. She cupped it in her hands like water. She drank from it. And then she opened her eyes and said silently into the grey air, "My name is Petronella Ashcroft. I am not mad. I am here, every morning, without fail." There was one attendant who was kind. Her name was Ruth, and she was perhaps 40, with rough hands and a face that had seen too much suffering to be shocked by any of it. Ruth brought Nell an extra blanket in winter when the cold crept through the stone and settled in her bones. Ruth saved her a second portion of bread when the kitchen had any to spare. And once, in the 2nd year, when Nell was sitting in the walled garden, watching the sky through a square of open air above the walls, Ruth sat beside her and said very quietly, "I believe you." Nell turned to look at her. "What?" "I have worked here 11 years. I have seen women who truly cannot help their delusions. Their eyes are different, their speech is different. There is a disconnection you learn to recognize. You do not have it. You never have." "Then help me." Ruth's face tightened with something that looked like pain. "If I write a letter on your behalf and they discover it, I lose my position. My children lose their bread. I have 3. The youngest is 4. Nell said nothing. She understood. She could not blame Ruth. She blamed the system that made a woman choose between compassion and survival. Ruth continued to bring the extra blankets, the extra bread, and every now and then, when no one was watching, she would say Nell's name, her real name. And it was like sunlight through the grate. Brief, insufficient, but enough to keep a person alive. In London, the Duke of Beaumont received the news of Nell Ashcroft's death the way he received most news. In silence, standing at the window of his study at Beaumont House, looking out at the rain. Farrow had brought the letter, a brief notice in the social columns of the Morning Post. "It is with regret that we announce the death of Miss Petronella Ashcroft, only daughter of the late Sir Gerard Ashcroft of Harrowfield, Devonshire, following a sudden and virulent fever. She was 19 years of age." The Duke read it once. He read it again. He set the paper down on his desk with a care that suggested the slightest excess of pressure would cause something to break. "When is the funeral?" he asked. "Tuesday, Your Grace, in Devonshire." "Prepare the carriage." He attended the funeral. He stood at the back of the church. He spoke to no one. He watched the coffin being lowered into the ground, elm wood, brass handles, roses on the lid. And he felt something inside his chest close shut. He had barely spoken to her. He had seen her once, exchanged a handful of words about roses while the ballroom swirled around them, watched her stand alone and refuse to be diminished by it, and he had thought, there, that one. And then she had been taken from the room by a woman with cold eyes. And then she had been taken from the world entirely, and now he was standing in a churchyard in the rain, watching them shovel earth over everything he had not yet said. Weeping was not in his nature. But something closed inside him that day. But he kept the dance card, the blank one. And every morning when he dressed and Pharaoh laid out his coat and his watch and his gloves, the Duke would slip the card into his breast pocket, over his heart where it had been every day since the ball. Pharaoh never asked about it. Pharaoh was not a man who asked unnecessary questions. Years passed. The Duke remained unmarried. The Tun whispered about it. 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, and still no duchess. His mother despaired. Matchmaking mothers presented their daughters at every event. He was civil, he was correct, he danced when propriety demanded it, and he chose no one. When asked, and he was asked, with increasing boldness, he would say simply, "I have not yet found what I am looking for." He never mentioned finding it and losing it. He never said that the thing he was looking for was buried in a churchyard in Devonshire. He kept silent about having chosen, years ago, in the space of a single evening, and that nothing since had come close. He said nothing. He was very good at saying nothing. But Pharaoh knew. Pharaoh, who laid out the Duke's clothes each morning and collected them each evening, knew that the card moved from one coat to another with a regularity that was almost religious. He knew that on the anniversary of the funeral, the 22nd of March, the Duke cancelled all engagements and spent the day alone in his study. He knew that a package arrived from Devonshire every spring, sent by a florist in the village, containing a single dried rose from the Harrowfield garden, and that the Duke pressed it between the pages of a book and never spoke of it. Pharaoh also knew that the Duke had, on 3 separate occasions, hired investigators to look into the circumstances of Nell's death. The first, in 1843, reported nothing unusual. The second, in 1845, confirmed the death certificate and the burial and concluded that the matter was closed. The third, in 1847, noted only that the Ashcroft estate was now being managed by Mrs. Hadwell, and that the house staff had been entirely replaced. None of them found anything, but none of them had looked in the right place. None of them had thought to look in a coffin. The Duke kept every report. He kept them in a drawer beside the card, and some nights when sleep would not come and the house was quiet and the fire had burned to nothing, he would take out the card and hold it, and think about a girl in a white dress who had caught a falling vase and talked about roses and looked at him across 60 feet of candle-lit space as her aunt dragged her away. 7 years. He had loved a woman he had never touched, never danced with, barely spoken to beyond a handful of sentences about overwatered roses. And he had buried that love in a grave in Devonshire and visited it every year and left roses on the headstone and never, not once, considered the possibility that the grave was empty. Until now. The rumour reached him in September of 1848. Pharaoh brought it, as Pharaoh brought everything, quietly, efficiently, with the discretion of a man who understood that information was currency and timing was everything. Your Grace, a matter has come to my attention which I believe may be of interest. The Duke looked up from his correspondence. What manner of matter? A colleague of mine, a valet in Lord Pennington's household, attended a dinner last week at which a Dr. Marchbank was present. Dr. Marchbank had recently visited Briarstone Asylum in Yorkshire to consult on a patient. While there, a woman approached him in the corridor and said something that struck him as unusual. What did she say? She said, "There is a woman here who does not belong. She has been here for years. Her name is not what they call her." The Duke's hand stilled on his pen. Marchbank mentioned it at dinner as a curiosity. Patients often make such claims, but my colleague overheard the conversation and, knowing of your Grace's continued interest in the Ashcroft matter, brought it to my attention. Silence. Briarstone is in Yorkshire, near Whitby, your Grace. And Miss Ashcroft's death, her funeral, how thoroughly was it verified? Farrow hesitated. A death certificate was signed by a Dr. Calvert. The burial was witnessed by the village. The coffin was... Was the body viewed? Another hesitation. I do not know, your Grace. The Duke set down his pen. He looked at the window. The rain, it was always raining, streaked the glass in thin, crooked lines. Find out, he said. Farrow nodded. And then, because he had served the Duke for 12 years and understood the weight of what was being asked, and if the body was not viewed, the Duke's jaw tightened. Then find out what is in that coffin. It took Farrow 3 weeks. He went to Devonshire. He spoke to the old sexton at St. Michael's who had dug the grave and remembered the funeral. He spoke to a former housemaid at Harrowfield who had been dismissed by Mrs. Hadwell the month before Nell's death, and who said, her voice shaking over a cup of tea in a coaching inn, that she had never been allowed to see the body. That Mrs. Hadwell had insisted the coffin remain closed because the fever had been so violent. That the doctor who signed the death certificate was not the village physician, but a man from London, whom none of them had ever seen before. Farrow brought all of this to the Duke on a Thursday evening in late September. The Duke listened without interruption. When Farrow finished, the room was so quiet that the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece sounded steady and insistent. "We open the grave," the Duke said. "Your Grace, that requires—" "I know what it requires. A magistrate's order or a coroner's warrant. I will have one by morning." He stood. "And Farrow, find out everything you can about Briarstone Asylum. Every patient admitted in the spring of 1842. Every name." "What name should I look for?" "I do not know. That is what frightens me." The exhumation took place on a Wednesday night. The Duke insisted on being present. The magistrate had not wanted to grant the order. One could not simply dig up graves in England, not even if one was a duke. But the evidence Farrow had gathered was compelling enough, and the Duke's reputation was formidable enough, and the quiet, unblinking way he had said, "I believe this woman may have been murdered," was unsettling enough that the order was signed within 12 hours. They dug by lantern light. 2 gravediggers and the sexton, with the Duke and Farrow standing at the edge and the rain turning the churchyard into a sea of mud. The elm coffin emerged from the earth blackened by years of damp, the brass handles green with verdigris. The sexton crossed himself. The Duke stepped forward. "Open it!" The lid was prized off with a creak that sounded in the silence of that churchyard like a scream. And there it was. Nothing. White silk, stained brown by time and moisture. Dead roses. Their petals turned to a fragile black dust that disintegrated at the first breath of air, a faint, sour smell of decay, not from a body, because there was no body, but from the organic matter of the roses themselves, years of slow decomposition in a sealed box. No bones, no hair, No teeth, no trace of the girl he had watched across a ballroom and carried in his pocket ever since. The coffin was empty. She had never been in it. This was the moment that Pharaoh had spoken about later, quietly, to no one but his own reflection in a glass of port. The moment the Duke of Beaumont looked into an empty coffin and understood that all this time he had been mourning a woman who might still be alive. His hands shook. His whole body shook. The lantern swayed in his grip and threw wild shadows across the headstone. Petronella Ashcroft, 1823 to 1842, beloved daughter. And the rain ran down his face, and he could not tell, and Pharaoh could not tell, and the gravediggers certainly could not tell whether the water on his cheeks was rain or something else. Entirely. "Briar Stone," the Duke said. His voice was barely a whisper. "How far?" 2 days by carriage, your grace. 1 if ride. We ride now. Tonight. Your grace, it is past midnight. The roads are now. They rode through the night. They changed horses twice, once at a coaching inn outside of Taunton, where the ostler took one look at the Duke's face and did not ask questions, and once at a post house near Sheffield, where Pharaoh paid double for their fastest mounts, and the stable boy whispered to the cook that he had never seen a gentleman ride like the devil himself was behind him. The Duke kept riding. He neither ate nor spoke. He rode with the single-minded focus of a man who has just discovered that the worst thing that ever happened to him might be a lie, and that every hour of delay was another hour that the person he had lost was suffering in a place he could not yet see. Pharaoh rode beside him in silence. There was nothing to say. They reached Briarstone late the following afternoon. It was a house of grey stone set against a grey sky, surrounded by a high wall with iron gates. The kind of building that had been designed to look respectable from a distance and to be as cheerless as possible once you were inside. The grounds were bare. The windows were barred. A thin woman in a grey dress answered when Pharaoh pulled the bell. "I am the Duke of Beaumont," the Duke said, and his voice was calm in the way that a drawn blade is calm. "I wish to see your patient register, specifically every woman admitted in the spring of 1842. The woman's face went white. "Your Grace, the director is not. I did not ask for the director. I asked for the register." He stepped past her into the hallway. The smell hit him. Carbolic, damp stone, something stale and human beneath it. And his stomach turned, but his expression held. "Now." The register was produced. The Duke turned the pages with hands that were steady despite everything. March 1842. April. There. March the 25th, 1842. 3 days after the funeral in Devonshire. Patient, Mary Poole, age 19. Admitted by Mrs. M. Hadwell, relation aunt. Diagnosis, hysteria and delusional episodes. Recommending physician, Dr. Calvert. Notes, patient claims to be someone else. Typical of condition. Restrict correspondence. The Duke stared at the entry until the letters blurred. "Mary Poole," he said softly. "Take me to her." "Your Grace, visiting hours are—" He turned and looked at the woman, and whatever she saw in his face stopped her mid-sentence. She swallowed. She picked up a ring of keys. "This way." The corridor was long and poorly lit, gas lamps at intervals too far apart, the light yellow and stuttering, casting shadows that made the walls seem to breathe. Doors on either side, heavy oak with iron bolts. Behind some of them, silence. Behind others, sounds that the Duke would not allow himself to think about. The woman stopped at a door near the end of the corridor. She selected a key from the ring. She hesitated. "Mary is one of our quieter patients," she said. "She has not had an episode in years. She is—" "Open the door." It swung inward. The room was small, perhaps 8 feet by 10. A cot against one wall, a wooden chair, a basin on a stand. The window was set high in the wall and covered with an iron grate. letting in a thin grey light that illuminated the room without warming it. A woman sat on the cot. She was thin, not fashionably slender. Thin in the way that people become when they have not eaten enough for a very long time. Her hair was dark and lank, pulled back from her face with a strip of cloth. Her skin was pale in the way that skin becomes when it has not seen proper sunlight in years. She wore a grey dress, the same shapeless grey as every other woman in this place, and her hands were folded in her lap, and she was looking at the wall. She kept her gaze on the wall when the door opened. She was used to doors opening and closing. She was used to people entering and leaving without speaking to her. She was used to being invisible. And then the Duke of Beaumont said her name. Not Mary. Not Poole. Nell. Her head turned, slowly. The way a person turns toward a sound they have not heard in so long that they are not sure they have really heard it. Her eyes, dark, large, deep and ancient, and, holding silence behind them, found his. She stared at him. She had no reason to recognize him. She had spoken to him once, briefly, 7 years ago. A stranger who steadied a vase and made a quiet remark about roses. She had never learned his name. The asylum had stripped away so much that even the faces she had known well had blurred into grey. This face, sharp, grey-eyed, intent, stirred something at the very bottom of her memory, but she could not place it. But she knew the way he said her name. She knew it because no one since they took her, had called her by it. "You know my name," she whispered. Her voice was rough, cracked, a voice that had spent years speaking only when spoken to. "I know your name." He was standing in the doorway and his hands were at his sides and his jaw was locked so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. "I know who you are, and I know who put you here." She stood. She was unsteady on her feet. The grey dress hung on her frame. She was 25 years old and she had the appearance of a woman who had been buried and had only just clawed her way back to the surface. "I have told them," she said. "I have told them for years. My name is Petronella Ashcroft. My father was Sir Gerard Ashcroft. My aunt—" "I know." His voice broke on the second word. The Duke of Beaumont, who had not raised his voice since the funeral, who had not shown emotion in public since he was a boy, whose composure was so legendary that the Ton called him the Marble Duke. His voice broke. "I know, and I'm taking you out of here. Right now. Today." He turned to the woman with the keys. She was standing behind him, her face the colour of chalk. "Tell me who ordered this," he said. And his voice was quiet again. The dangerous kind of quiet. "Tell me who brought her here. Tell me who signed the papers. Tell me who has been paying to keep her locked in this room. And then you are going to give me every document, every ledger, every record this institution possesses, or I will have this building torn down stone by stone and every person who works here standing before a magistrate by the end of the week." The woman with the keys began to cry. Their tears meant nothing to him. He turned back to Nell. She stood in the middle of the room, swaying slightly, her hands pressed together in front of her, holding herself together by sheer will. "Can you walk?" he asked. She looked at him. This stranger who had appeared in her doorway and said her name, and whose voice had broken when he said, "I know." This man whose eyes were grey and steady and full of something no one had shown her since before the grey walls. "Yes," she said, "I can walk." She walked out of Briarstone Asylum on the afternoon of the 23rd of October, 1848. She had entered it on the 25th of March, 1842. She had been 19 years old. She was now 25, 2,404 days. She counted every single one. And as she stepped through the iron gates and into the open air, real air, air that smelled of rain and heather and the distant salt of the sea. She stopped. She closed her eyes. She tilted her face upward and let the rain fall on her skin. The Duke watched her. He watched her the way he had watched her at Almac.S across a ballroom, with a focus so complete that the rest of the world simply ceased to exist. Pharaoh, standing by the horses, looked at his employer's face and quietly decided that whoever had done this to her was going to wish they had never been born. He was not wrong, but the revenge, when it came, would be more devastating, more public and more complete than even Pharaoh could have imagined. What happened in a London ballroom 6 weeks later would be spoken about in drawing rooms for the next 50 years. But first, she had to learn to be alive again. The carriage ride south was 3 days long. The Duke had arranged for a private coach, not the fast, rattling post-chaise they had ridden up in, but a proper travelling carriage, well sprung with cushions and wool blankets and a hamper of food prepared by the best inn in Whitby. He sat across from her rather than beside her. He understood in some intuitive way that had nothing to do with experience and everything to do with attention, that a woman who had spent years in confinement would need as much space as he could give her. Nell ate slowly. She tore pieces from a bread roll and chewed each one as if she were relearning the mechanics of it. She drank tea from a tin cup and held it with both hands, and her fingers trembled. She was silent for the first hour. The Duke did not press her. He sat with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the road, and he waited. He was, as he had always been, a patient man. "You were at the ball," she said finally. Her voice still had that rough, cracked quality, calm, the sound of an instrument that had not been played in years. He looked at her. "You remember?" "I remember everything." She set the cup down. "May 1841, Almack's. I was standing by a pillar. No one asked me to dance, but there was a man who caught a vase when it fell, and who said something about roses needing space to breathe, and who watched me from across the room for the rest of the evening. I never learned his name. Rawdon Voss, Duke of Beaumont." "Why were you watching me?" He paused. The carriage swayed over a rutted section of road. "Because you were the only person in that room who was not performing," he said. "Everyone else was playing a part, smiling for the right people, laughing at the right moments, positioning themselves in the right light. You were simply standing, and the way you stood, straight, calm, as if you had decided the room could do what it liked, and you would remain exactly who you were. I had never seen anyone do that." Her eyes held his for a long time. "That is a great deal to read into a woman standing by a pillar." "I have had 6 years to think about it." Silence. "You came to my funeral," she said. "Yes." "Why?" "Because I had intended to come back for you. I had been writing to your aunt for months, asking to call on you. She refused every letter. I was waiting for the season. I would have found you in London, made my case in person, and then you died." He paused. "Except you did not." "No?" Her voice was very quiet. "I did not. I stood at the back of the church. I did not know your aunt. I had never met her. I had spoken to you once for 30 seconds about roses. I had no right to grieve, and I grieved anyway." He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and drew out something small and creased and worn soft with handling. "I have carried this since that night." He held it out. She took it. She turned it over in her thin, scarred fingers. It was a dance card, blank, every line empty. "You kept this," she said. "It was the only proof that you existed." Something shifted behind her eyes. She did not cry. She was long past crying over things like tenderness. Crying was a luxury reserved for people who had not spent 6 years being taught that tenderness was a trap. But her breath caught, and she pressed the card to her chest, and she held it there. They did not speak again for an hour, but the silence between them changed. It had been the silence of strangers. Now it was the silence of two people who understood that something had begun. Beaumont Park was vast, a Palladian house of honey-coloured stone set in 2,000 acres of parkland in Hampshire, with a lake, formal gardens, a succession of glass houses, and a stable block larger than most houses. Nell had grown up in a comfortable home, but Harrowfield was a gentleman's residence. Beaumont Park was an empire. The Duke installed her in the East Wing, a suite of rooms, a bedchamber, a sitting room, a private dressing room that looked out over the lake. The furniture was good, but not overwhelming. The curtains were light. The windows were large and could be opened. He had thought about the windows. He had sent Farrow ahead to instruct the housekeeper, Mrs. Treadwell, that every window in Miss Ashcroft's rooms was to be fully operational. No locks, no bars, no restriction on light or air. After years in a room with a window she could not open, the ability to breathe freely was not a comfort. It was a necessity. Mrs. Treadwell was a woman of 50 with a broad, kind face and the efficient warmth of someone who had managed a household of 30 servants for 2 decades. She took one look at Nell. Thin, pale, wearing a dress that did not fit her properly because everything she owned had been bought in haste on the journey south, and her expression remained steady, but her eyes softened. "Come with me, my dear," she said. "We will get you settled." Nell followed her. At the door of the suite she stopped. "These rooms," she said, "are they locked?" "They are not, Miss Ashcroft, and they will not be." "And if I want to leave?" "Then you leave. This is not a prison, it is a home, and you are not a patient, you are a guest of the Duke of Beaumont." Nell stood in the doorway and looked at the open windows and the light pouring in and the wide, unbarred view of the lake. "I would like to be alone now," she said. Mrs. Treadwell nodded. "Ring the bell if you need anything at all." The door closed, from the inside, because Nell closed it herself. She stood in the middle of the room. She walked to the window. She opened it. Cold October air flooded in, carrying the smell of cut grass and rain-washed stone and the faint mineral scent of the lake. She put both hands on the windowsill and breathed until her lungs ached. Then she sat on the floor, wrapped her arms around her knees, and wept. Not quietly, not with restraint. She wept the way a person weeps when they have been holding themselves together with nothing but willpower for all those days, and the willpower is no longer required. She wept for an hour. When she stopped, she felt lighter, hollowed out, but cleaner. She washed her face in the basin. She unpinned her hair. She climbed into the bed, which was soft, impossibly soft, after years on a thin cot, and she fell asleep with the window open and the sound of wind in the trees, and no locked door between her and the world. And the Duke gave her space. He was rigorous about it. He stayed away from her door. He sent no invitation to dine. He sent meals to her room on a tray. Good meals, nourishing ones, broth and fresh bread and roasted chicken and early apples from the orchard. And he sent, with each tray, a small note. "If you would like company, I am in the library. If you would not, that is perfectly acceptable. D.R.V." The same note, every meal, for the first week. Nell read each one. She returned to her room instead. She spent the first days relearning the textures of freedom. She walked the gardens, slowly at first, her legs weak from years of limited movement, then farther, then longer. She sat by the lake and watched the geese. She found the glass house and stood among the orchids and the warmth and breathed air that smelled green and alive. On the 5th day, she asked Mrs. Treadwell for books. "What would you like to read, Miss Ashcroft?" "Everything." Mrs. Treadwell brought her armfuls from the library, novels, histories, poetry, a volume of botanical illustrations. Nell devoured them. She read the way a starving person eats, urgently, with a desperate, grateful attention that made Mrs. Treadwell press her lips together and leave the room quickly before her composure failed. On the 8th day, Nell went to the library. The Duke was there. He was seated in a wing chair by the fire, reading. He looked up when she entered. He remained seated. A deliberate choice. He refused to tower over her, refused to let the difference in their heights to feel like authority. "Good evening," he said. "Good evening." She paused at the threshold, one hand on the frame. "I have been reading your books. I noticed. Mrs. Treadwell tells me you have gone through 9 volumes in 3 days. I was behind." Something that might have been a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Please. Sit." She sat, across from him, in the other wing chair. The fire crackled between them. Outside, the October wind pressed against the windows. "You have questions," he said. "Many." "Ask them." She studied him. The firelight caught the angles of his face, sharp jaw, straight nose, the grey eyes that held steady on hers without wavering. His was not the handsomeness that women swooned over in novels. He was compelling. He had the kind of face that became more interesting the longer you looked at it. "Why did you come for me?" she asked. "You saw me once, at a ball, 6 years ago. We spoke for half a minute about roses. You do not know me." "That is true. I do not know you." He set his book down. "But I have thought about you every day since that ball. I have carried a piece of you in my pocket since the night we almost met. I have turned down every eligible woman in England because none of them were you. And when I opened that coffin and found it empty, when I understood that you might be alive somewhere, suffering, locked away, I rode through the night without stopping because the idea that you were in pain and I was not there was the most intolerable thing I had ever felt." He paused. "You asked me why. That is why." The fire popped. A log shifted, sending sparks upward. "You are either the most devoted man I have ever met," Nell said slowly, "or the most obsessive. I am aware that there may not be a meaningful difference." The ghost of a smile crossed her face. It was the closest she had come to smiling since Brierston, and it changed her entire face, lifted something that had been held down so long that the muscles had almost forgotten how. She caught it before it formed fully, startled by the unfamiliar sensation, and looked away. "I need time," she said. "Before anything. Before whatever this is. I need time." "You have it." His voice was steady. "I am not going anywhere, and neither are you unless you choose to." "And my aunt?" Something changed in his expression. The warmth that had been present, cautious, restrained, but warm, vanished, replaced by something so cold it seemed to lower the temperature of the room. "Your aunt is being dealt with," he said. "Farrow is gathering evidence. Dr. Calvert's involvement, the solicitor who handled the inheritance transfer, the payments to Brierstone, every document, every signature, every coin. What will you do? I will destroy them." He said it simply, without drama, the way one might say, "I will have tea." "Every person who participated in burying you alive will lose everything they have, their reputations, their positions, their freedom, if the law allows it. And your aunt will stand in a room full of the same people who mourned you, and she will watch them learn exactly what she did." Nell was quiet for a long time. "You are frightening," she said. "I know." "Good." She stood. "I will see you at breakfast." She left the library. The Duke sat in the firelight and listened to her footsteps fade down the corridor. He picked up his book. He stared at the page without seeing a word. He sat for a long time, looking at the fire, and at last the weight in his chest felt different, not gone, but changed. The grief had been replaced by something sharper and more useful. Purpose. Can I just say, this next part of the story is one of my favorites because this is where the real tension begins. Not the danger, not the revenge. The tension between two people who have been circling each other without ever meeting properly. The tension of recovery, of trust being built one careful conversation at a time. She came to breakfast the next morning. They sat across from each other in the morning room, a room filled with pale autumn light, and they ate in near silence. But it was a comfortable silence, the silence of two people who were learning each other's rhythms. She came, the next morning, and the next. By the second week they had established a pattern, breakfast together in the morning room. She would walk the grounds alone in the mornings while he attended to estate business. In the afternoons, they would find each other in the library, sometimes reading, sometimes talking, sometimes simply existing in the same room while the fire burned low and the light faded outside the windows. She noticed things about him, small things, the way he always entered a room quietly, as if trying not to startle her. The way he never stood between her and a door, the way he asked permission before sitting near her every single time, as if her comfort were a question that required a fresh answer each day. One afternoon she found him in the garden, of all places. He was standing by the rose beds, bare now, pruned for winter, nothing but thorny stalks and dark soil, and he was staring at them with an expression she could not immediately read. "You dislike roses?" she said. He turned. "I beg your pardon." "The flowers throughout the house are chrysanthemums and dahlias, never roses. And the arrangement that was in my room when I arrived was replaced within an hour of my asking Mrs. Treadwell about Harrowfield's gardens." His expression shifted. Something vulnerable moved beneath the surface. "They put roses in the coffin," he said. "Your coffin. I could smell them when we opened it 6 years underground, and I could still smell them." "And you cannot look at roses without thinking of a grave." "I cannot look at roses without thinking of you in a grave, which is worse." She stood beside him, not touching, close enough to feel the warmth of his arm through the wool of his coat. "My father planted these," she said, looking at a bare rose bush. "Not these roses specifically, but roses like them, the same varieties. He planted them the year I was born, pink damask. They bloomed every June. I will have these removed if—" "No." She touched a bare branch with one finger. The thorns had been dulled by autumn frost. She used them to make the lie beautiful. I am going to take them back. When they bloom in June, they will be mine again, not hers." The Duke looked at her. The grey autumn light caught her face, and the wind moved the loose strands of her hair, and she was standing in a dead garden, talking about reclaiming beauty from the people who stole it. And he thought, "I will love this woman until they put me in the ground, and I will mean it every day." He kept this to himself. What he said was, "Mrs. Treadwell has made gingerbread. Would you like some?" She almost smiled again. "Yes." She began to fill in the details of her captivity, slowly, in fragments. A sentence here, a memory there, offered without preamble and often followed by a long silence. She told him about the marks on the wall. 2,190 scratches. She told him about the hairpin. She told him about the day she stopped saying her real name because her truth was being used as evidence of madness. He listened. He never interrupted, never offered comfort or platitudes. He simply listened, and sometimes when she finished speaking, he would be very still for a moment, and then he would say, "Thank you for telling me." Once, she asked, "Does it change the way you think of me, knowing I was there?" "Yes," he said. "It makes me think you are the strongest person I have ever known." It was on a Tuesday, the beginning of the third week, that the Duke heard music. He was in his study, signing correspondence, when the sound reached him through the wall. Faint at first, hesitant. A single note, then another. Then a pause so long he thought he had imagined it. Then a chord, uncertain, slightly off, the way a hand remembers a shape it has not made in years. He set down his pen. The music room was at the end of the east corridor, a room he had not entered in months. The door was ajar. He walked to it and stopped. Outside. He stopped outside. She was sitting at the pianoforte. The lid was raised. Her hands were on the keys. Thin hands, the knuckles still too sharp, the skin still too pale, and she was playing something he almost recognized. A Beethoven adagio. She had learned it as a girl, perhaps. Her fingers stumbled on a passage, stopped, went back, tried again. The notes filled the room, gradually, unevenly, slowly, unevenly, with small spills and hesitations. She reached a section that flowed. 4 bars, then 8, then 12, her body settling into the muscle memory the way a rider settles into a saddle after years away. The music became steadier, richer, and then, without warning, it became something else entirely. She was not playing from memory anymore. She was playing from somewhere deeper, from the place where she had spent years without sound, without music, without anything but the creak of a building and the weeping of strangers through stone walls. The music was not beautiful. It was necessary. It was the sound of a woman remembering that her hands could make something other than marks on a wall. She played for 40 minutes. The Duke stood in the corridor for every one of them. He stayed where he was, unannounced, and simply stood with his shoulder against the wall and his eyes closed and listened. Mrs. Treadwell found him there. She looked at him, and at the half-open door, and at the expression on his face, which was open and devastated, and full of something that Mrs. Treadwell, who had been married for 26 years before her husband died, recognized immediately. Without a word, she turned and walked back the way she had come. Some moments were not meant to be interrupted. That evening at supper, because Nell now came to supper, sitting across from him at a table, meant for 20, the two of them eating in companionable quiet at one end, she said, without looking up from her soup, "I found the music room." "I know. Did you hear?" "Yes." She paused. "I used to play for my father every evening after dinner. He would sit in his armchair by the fire and close his eyes and listen. He said it was the best part of his day." She set down her spoon. "That was the first time I have played since the night before they took me." "You play beautifully." "I play badly. My hands have forgotten almost everything." "They will remember." Her gaze found his across the table, and her expression held at last something other than wariness or gratitude or the careful neutrality of a woman still assessing whether the world she had been returned to was safe. What it held was warmth, quiet, tentative, easily startled, but warm. "Will you sit in the music room tomorrow?" she asked. "While I practice. My father used to sit and listen, and I played better when someone was there. I will be there." He was, every afternoon. He sat in the armchair by the window with a book open and unread, and she played, haltingly at first, then with growing confidence, then with a fierce, concentrated joy that transformed her face into something incandescent. He watched her more than he watched the page. He could not help it. He had been watching her since that first evening. They walked the grounds together on the last day of October. The air was sharp, the sky a pale, washed grey, the trees stripped bare so that the bones of the parkland showed through. The rolling hills, the lake, flat as tin, the distant line of the downs on the horizon. "Tell me about your father," he said. The silence stretched between them as they walked side by side. Not touching, never touching, the space between them charged with the particular electricity of two people who are aware of every inch that separates them. "He was kind," she said finally. "Not soft. Kind. There is a difference. He expected me to be intelligent, and he was disappointed when I was not. He taught me to manage accounts because he said a woman who could not read a ledger was a woman who could be cheated, and he would not have his daughter cheated." She paused. "He also read me Virgil, in the original. He said the Aeneid was the greatest love story ever written, and that anyone who thought it was only about war had not been paying attention." "He sounds like a man I would have liked. He would have interrogated you. He never trusted men with titles. He said titles made men lazy." He was not wrong. She almost smiled. Then, "He died in my arms, did I tell you that?" "February." It was snowing. I held his hand, and he looked at me and said, "You will be extraordinary, Nell. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise." And then he was gone. And 3 weeks later my aunt arrived, and I never heard those words again. Not once. For 7 years. She stopped walking. They were at the edge of the lake. The water lapped against the stones with small, persistent sounds. "Why were you alone at the ball?" she asked. He looked at her. "You were watching me, but you were also alone. The most eligible duke in England standing by himself at Almack's. Why?" He let the silence hold. The wind moved across the lake and pushed ripples toward the far shore. "Because I had spent my entire life being wanted for the wrong reasons," he said. "For the title, for the money, for the houses and the carriages and the 40,000 a year. Every conversation I had with a woman of society was a negotiation wearing a mask. Every smile was calculated. Every laugh was performed. I stood at the edge of rooms because from the edge you can see who is real and who is acting." He paused, and then I saw you, standing alone, not performing for anyone, and I thought, she is the only honest person in this room. You built a great deal on very little evidence. I built everything on 30 seconds and a conversation about roses, and I was right. They stood at the edge of the lake. The wind was cold. Neither of them moved to go inside. "My father would have liked you," she said quietly. "He would have interrogated you mercilessly. But he would have liked you." It was the closest she had come to saying what they both knew was growing between them. She left it unsaid. The words were unnecessary. He heard it anyway. It was during the 4th week that the incident with Lord Alderton occurred. Alderton was a neighbour, a jovial, round-faced baron with more charm than sense, who had called at Beaumont Park the previous week to discuss a boundary dispute about a stream. On that occasion, he had been introduced to Nell, held her hand a moment too long, and been swiftly redirected to the Duke's study. He should have taken the hint. The hint was lost on him. He returned the following Thursday, and told to bike, uninvited, unannounced, arriving in his carriage at 3:30 with a bouquet of hothouse chrysanthemums and a smile that suggested he had rehearsed it in a mirror. The Duke was not at home. He had ridden out to the tenant farms that morning and was not expected back until dark. Alderton knew this. He had inquired. Nell was in the drawing-room when he was shown in. She rose, surprised. "Lord Alderton, the Duke is not—" "I know." He crossed the room with a confidence that had not been present during his first visit. He held out the flowers. These are for you, Miss Ashcroft. I thought you might enjoy something to brighten the house. November is so dreadfully grey. That is kind, but I confess I have been thinking about you since my last visit. A woman of your quality, shut away here in the country with only Beaumont for company. It seems a waste. He took a step closer. He is not the warmest of men, as I am sure you have noticed. Cold, they call him. The Marble Duke. Surely you deserve better conversation than... Lord Alderton, I must ask you to... He reached for her hand. Not the polite, glancing touch of a gentleman. He took her hand and held it, his fingers pressing against hers, his thumb moving across her knuckles in a gesture that was unmistakably intimate. Nell pulled back, hard. Remove your hand. I meant no offense. I only... Remove it. He did. But he held his ground. He was standing close enough that she could smell the claret on his breath. He had fortified himself before arriving, apparently, and his eyes moved over her face with an appraisal that made her skin crawl. You are far more striking than they said, he murmured. Beaumont does not deserve... The drawing room door opened, not with a crash. Worse. It opened quietly, deliberately, with the controlled precision of a man who has entered a room and assessed its contents in the space of a single breath. The Duke stood in the doorway, still in his riding clothes, mud on his boots, his hair wind-disordered, his crop still in his hand. He had returned early. He was looking at Alderton with an expression that contained no anger, no heat, nothing at all except a stillness so absolute that it seemed to drain the warmth from the room. "Alderton," he said. His voice was pleasant, conversational. "Step away from her." Alderton stepped away. The colour had left his face. "I was merely paying a social..." "You came to my home while I was absent. You brought flowers for a woman under my protection. You touched her without her consent. And you are now going to leave, and you are never going to return. And if I hear that you have spoken her name in any context at all, to anyone, I will ensure that every door in Hampshire closes to you permanently." The Duke had not raised his voice. He did not need to. "Your boundary dispute will be settled by my solicitor. You will accept whatever terms he offers. We are finished." Alderton worked his jaw. Nothing useful emerged. "Your crop, Your Grace," he said weakly, gesturing. "You are holding your riding crop." The Duke looked down at the crop in his hand. He looked back at Alderton. "Yes," he said, "I am." Alderton left. He fled. His carriage was heard on the gravel drive within 2 minutes. The horses whipped to a speed that suggested their owner was in some haste to put distance between himself and the Duke of Beaumont. The chrysanthemums remained on the floor where Alderton had dropped them. The Duke looked at Nell. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Did he touch you before I arrived?" "He took my hand. I pulled away. He stopped short of forcing it." A muscle in the Duke's jaw worked. He set the riding crop down on the table with exaggerated care, the care of a man who was choosing not to break something. "If I had arrived 5 minutes later..." "You arrived exactly when you needed to." She crossed the room and stood in front of him. "How did you know?" "I did not. I came back early because the weather turned." He paused. "I will not always be here to..." "I handled him. Before you arrived, I told him to remove his hand, and he did. I am not helpless." "I know you are not helpless. That is not the point." "Then what is the point?" His jaw tightened again. His grey eyes were dark with something that went beyond protectiveness, beyond duty, beyond any rational response to a neighbour with poor manners and a bouquet of chrysanthemums. "The point," he said very quietly, is that the idea of another man touching you makes me want to set fire to something. And I am not a man who says things like that. I am controlled, I am measured, I am rational, and none of that seems to matter. When it comes to you. Nell looked at him. At this man who had ridden through the night and opened a coffin and carried a blank card and stood in a corridor listening to her play piano and was now standing in his own drawing room, still in his muddy boots, admitting that his composure cracked where she was concerned. "Good," she said, and she walked past him and out of the room, and she was smiling. Actually smiling for the first time since Brierstone, and she kept it hidden from him. But Mrs. Treadwell, passing in the corridor, saw it, and she smiled too. That night, for the first time, Nell came to find him, not in the library where they usually met by unspoken agreement. She came to his study. The door was closed. She knocked. 2 quick raps. Decisive, nothing tentative about them. "Come in." She entered carrying a ledger. A large one, leather-bound, the kind used for estate accounts. She set it on his desk. "This is wrong," she said. He looked at the ledger. It was the Beaumont Park household accounts for the current quarter. He looked at her. "Your steward is overcharging for candles," she said, "by roughly £12 a quarter. The beeswax tallow rate in Hampshire is 3 shillings 4 per dozen. He is billing at 4 shillings 2. Over a year, that is £48, which is nearly a housemaid's annual wage." The Duke stared at her. "I found it this afternoon. I was in the library looking for the botanical volume on English ferns, and the ledger was on the shelf beside it. And I could not help myself. I have not read an account book since they took me. My hands itched." Something shifted in his face. Not amusement exactly. Something warmer and more private than amusement. Something that looked like recognition. "You audited my household accounts," he said. "I audited your candle expenditure. I have not yet reached the coal, though I have suspicions." He leaned back in his chair. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her at the ball, with that complete focused attention that made the rest of the room disappear. But this time, there was something else in it. Delight. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, "are you telling me that you have been in my home for 4 weeks, and the first thing you choose to do on your own initiative is catch my steward stealing? My father taught me to read a ledger before he taught me to read Latin. He said the numbers never lie." She paused. "And I am tired of being a guest. Guests do not audit the candles. I want to be useful. I want to do something that matters. Then do it." He pushed the ledger back toward her. "Every account, every quarter. If my steward is cheating me, I want to know. And when you have finished with the household, there are 6 tenant farms that have not been properly audited in 3 years. She picked up the ledger. She held it against her chest the way she had held the card in the carriage. Something precious. Something reclaimed. "Thank you," she said. "You are thanking me for giving you permission to work." "I am thanking you for seeing me, not as someone to be rescued, as someone who is capable." She left. The Duke sat at his desk and stared at the door she had closed behind her, and he thought she caught a £12 discrepancy in the candle accounts on a casual glance. Her father trained her to run an estate, and her aunt locked her away for years. The rage, which had been banked and controlled and channeled into legal proceedings and careful evidence-gathering, flared white-hot for a moment. He breathed through it. He filed it away. It would keep until the ball. November arrived with frost on the lawns and fires in every room and the smell of wood smoke drifting through the corridors of Beaumont Park. Nell's body was recovering, Mrs. Treadwell ensured she ate well, and the daily walks had brought colour back to her cheeks and strength back to her legs. But it was her mind that concerned the Duke. Not because she was fragile. Fragile was the wrong word. She was the least breakable person he had ever known. But she carried the asylum with her in ways that were invisible until they were not. She flinched at the sound of keys jangling. She could not sleep if the door was fully closed. She woke some nights gasping, disoriented, reaching for the wall to count marks that were not there. The Duke knew these things. Because Mrs. Treadwell told him, and Mrs. Treadwell told him because she understood without being asked that the Duke's interest in Nell's well-being was not casual and was not temporary and was not something that could be addressed by simply providing adequate meals and a comfortable bed. "She is stronger every day, Your Grace," Mrs. Treadwell said one morning, "but she will carry this, not always so heavily, but always. I know. And she will need to choose in her own time what she wants her life to be. You cannot choose it for her." The Duke looked at his housekeeper with an expression that was, for one unguarded moment, entirely vulnerable. "I know that too," he said quietly. Mrs. Treadwell nodded and left the room, and if she dabbed her eyes in the corridor, there was no one to see it. It was the dance card that undid everything, not the one he carried. That was safely in his pocket. It was a different dance card, a new one, that Nell found in his study one afternoon when she went looking for a book on Roman aqueducts that Mrs. Treadwell said was on the second shelf. The study door was open. The Duke was not there. Nell found the book, and beside it, on the desk, a piece of paper in the Duke's handwriting. It was a dance card, a fresh one, blank, the kind used at formal balls, and in his neat, precise hand, he had written on every line, all 12 of them, the same name. Nell Ashcroft, 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 Nell Ashcroft. Nell Ashcroft. Every dance, every line, her name, only her name. She had not moved when he found her. He stopped short. His eyes went from her face to the card in her hands and back again. For a moment, for the first time since she had known him, he looked uncertain. "I was not meant to see this," she said. "No?" Every line. Every line. "Since when?" "Since the night I picked up your card at Almack's and every line was empty. I thought, if I could not dance with you then, I would keep every dance for you until I could." She set the card down. She walked toward him. He stayed perfectly still. She stopped close enough that she could see the pulse beating in his throat, fast, the only part of him that betrayed any agitation. "You are an extraordinary man," she said. "I am a man who has been waiting a very long time." "Then stop waiting." She kissed him. It was not practiced. It was not elegant. She had never kissed anyone before. She simply stood on her toes and pressed her mouth to his, and his hands came up, slowly, carefully, with immense trembling care, and settled on either side of her face, and he kissed her back with a restraint so total, so disciplined, that it vibrated between them like a held note. When she pulled away, his eyes were closed. His thumbs rested on her cheekbones. His breath was unsteady. "Nell," he said, just her name, as if it were the only word that mattered. "Do not stop saying my name," she whispered. "They took it from me for 6 years. Do not stop." "I will not." He opened his eyes. "I will never stop." It was 3 days later that she overheard the conversation. She had been walking to the conservatory through the servants' passage, a route she preferred, because it was quieter and because old habits of navigating through back corridors died hard, when she heard 2 housemaids talking on the other side of a linen cupboard. "You don't really think he'll marry her, do you?" "Course he will," She's got 8,000 a year. He's been after the Ashcroft estate since before she supposedly died. That's not... Think about it. He goes all the way to Yorkshire to dig up some mad girl from an asylum, brings her back here, nurses her to health. And oh, coincidentally, she's the sole heiress to one of the richest estates in Devonshire. Do you think he'd have ridden through the night if she'd been poor? That seems harsh. That seems like a duke. Nell stood in the corridor, one hand on the wall, and felt the ground shift beneath her. The Ashcroft estate, 8,000 a year. She had almost forgotten how strange that was, how thoroughly years in a grey room could strip away your sense of what you owned. She was an heiress. She had always been an heiress. Her aunt had tried to steal it. The Duke had rescued her. And now, the thought crept in like ice water. Had he rescued her, or had he rescued the estate? She knew, rationally, that it made no sense. He had carried that card since the funeral. He had written her name 12 times on a blank card. He had ridden through the night. He had held her face in his hands and said her name like a prayer. A man calculating an investment would never do those things. But the poison of the asylum was still in her. 6 years of being told her reality was delusion. 6 years of having her truth twisted into evidence of madness. It had left a residue, a corrosive doubt that could turn the clearest evidence into something uncertain. And the servant's words, sharp and specific, lodged in that doubt and festered. She turned away from the conservatory. She went to her room. She closed the door. She missed dinner that evening, and breakfast the next morning, and the morning after that. On the third morning, she was gone. Not to her room, not to the music room, not to the garden or the lake or any of the places she had slowly, carefully made her own over the past 5 weeks. She had taken a cloak from the front hall and walked out the front door at dawn, and she had not come back. Mrs. Treadwell discovered her absence at 8 o'clock and informed the Duke at 8:05, and the expression on his face when he heard the words, "She is not in the house," was something Mrs. Treadwell would remember for the rest of her life. It was not panic. It was worse than panic. It was the face of a man who had opened an empty coffin and sworn it would never happen again, and was now standing in his breakfast room being told that she was gone. "Saddle my horse," he said. He was out the door before the sentence was finished. He found her at noon, not on the road, not at an inn. She was in the village church, a small stone chapel, 3 miles from Beaumont Park, with a square Norman tower and a graveyard full of lichen-crusted headstones. She was sitting in the front pew, her cloak still around her shoulders, her hands in her lap, staring at the altar. She kept her eyes on the altar when the door opened. She knew it was him. She had known he would come. "I sat in a church while they buried me," she said. Her voice echoed in the empty space. "Not this church, St. Michael's in Devonshire. I was not there, of course. I was already drugged and in a carriage. But the funeral happened in a church. People sat in pews and wept, and none of them knew the coffin was empty." He walked down the aisle. His boots were loud on the stone floor. He stopped at the end of her pew. He remained standing. "The servants say you came for the money," she said. "I know what they say. And the voice in my head, the one they spent all those years building, the one that tells me nothing good is what it seems, that every kindness has a price, that voice agrees with them." Her eyes, when they met his, were red but dry. She had finished crying. What was left was something harder and more honest than tears. "I need you to understand what they did to me. Not the room, not the restraints, not the cold or the hunger or the loneliness. What they did was teach me to doubt. Every truth I held they told me was a delusion. Every memory I clung to they called a symptom. They did not break my body. They broke the part of me that knows how to believe. The Duke sat down in the pew beside her, not close, an arm's length away, the space between them filled with cold church air and the faint smell of candle wax and old stone. "Then I will tell you what I believe," he said, "and you can decide for yourself whether it is true." She waited. "I believe that I saw a girl at a ball who was more real than anyone else in the room. I believe that I carried a blank card from that night because the idea of her dancing with no one was intolerable to me. I believe that when I opened a coffin and found it empty, the first thought in my mind was not inheritance. It was alive. I believe that I rode through the night because every mile between us was agony. And I believe—" His voice caught. He steadied it. "I believe that if you walk away from me right now, if you leave this church and never come back, I will let you go. Because the last thing I will ever do is trap you somewhere you do not want to be. You have had enough of locked rooms. I will not be another one." The silence in the church was absolute. Even the wind had stopped. "You would let me go," she said. "Yes. Even if it destroyed you." "Especially then, because love that holds someone against their will is not love. It is what your aunt did. And I would rather lose you than become the thing that hurt you." She turned in the pew to face him fully. Her face was pale. Her hands were shaking. She looked as though standing at the edge of a precipice, a cliff, a decision, a life, trying to decide whether to step forward or back. "My father said I would be extraordinary," she whispered, "and then no one said anything like it for 7 years, until you looked into that room and said my name. Nell. Say it again. Nell." He reached across the space between them, his hand, palm up, open, on the pew between them. An offering, not a command. "Come home with me." She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She looked at the altar and the empty pews and the bare walls of a church that smelled of candle wax and centuries. She put her hand in his. "Take me home," she said. They rode back to Beaumont Park together. She sat in front of him on the horse, his arm around her waist, her head against his shoulder. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. Something had been settled in that church, not with grand declarations or dramatic gestures, but with an open hand on a pew and a choice made freely. She had chosen to stay, not because she was trapped, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because the man who had opened a coffin and ridden through the night and stood in a corridor listening to her play piano had just offered to let her go. And that was how she knew he was real. They married quietly in the chapel at Beaumont Park on the 12th of November, 1848. The chapel was small. Stone walls, a single stained glass window throwing coloured light across the floor, candles lit along the aisle because the November sky outside was the colour of pewter and offered nothing. Mrs. Treadwell had placed white chrysanthemums on the altar, not roses. Nell had not needed to ask. She walked down the aisle alone. There was no one to give her away. Her father was dead. Her aunt was the reason she needed giving away in the first place. So she walked alone, her hand steady, her spine straight, the ivory silk whispering against the stone floor with each step. The Duke stood at the altar and watched her come. He was wearing black, as always. His hands were at his sides. His face held an expression that Pharaoh, standing to his left as witness, had never seen before and would never see again. Open, undefended, stripped of every layer of composure and control that the marble Duke had spent 35 years building. He looked like a man who had been waiting at the end of a very long road and could finally see the person he had been waiting for. Nell reached the altar. She looked up at him. The candlelight caught the pearl comb in her hair, his mother's, and the small scar on her wrist that the sleeve of the dress could not quite hide. "I, Petronella Ashcroft, take thee, Rawdon Voss." Her voice was steady, clear. The voice of a woman who had spent 6 years being called someone else and was now standing in a chapel, saying her own name, binding it to his. Her voice never faltered, never hesitated. She said them the way she said everything, with the quiet, immovable certainty of a woman who had decided and who would not be moved. Mrs. Treadwell wept. Farrow maintained his composure admirably, though his eyes were suspiciously bright. The vicar was elderly and kind, and asked no questions about why the bride was so thin or why the groom held her hand throughout the ceremony with a grip that suggested permanence. That night, in the bedroom that looked out over the lake, the Duke traced the thin scar on her wrist. A mark from the restraints they had used the first time she tried to escape Briarstone, 3 months in, before she learned that resistance was punished and compliance was the only path to survival. "Tell me about this," he said. His lips were against her skin. His voice was barely audible. "Leather straps. They held me down for 2 days. His jaw tightened. His lips pressed against the scar, pressing tenderness into the place where leather straps had once held her down. "Every mark," he said, "every single one, I will answer for." "Is that a promise?" "It is a vow." The ball was held on the 28th of November. The Duke had planned it with the precision of a military campaign. Farrow had spent weeks compiling the evidence. Dr. Calvert's original death certificate obtained from the parish. Records. The admission ledger from Briarstone, showing Mary Poole entered on the 25th of March, 1842, 3 days after the funeral. Bank records showing quarterly payments from Mrs. Hadwell to Briarstone, drawn on the Ashcroft estate accounts. A letter from Mr. Grieve, the solicitor, confirming the transfer of the estate to Mrs. Hadwell as next of kin following the death of the heir. And a sworn statement from the former housemaid who had been dismissed from Harrowfield the month before Nell's disappearance, who testified that she had never been allowed to see the body, and that Mrs. Hadwell had insisted the coffin remained sealed. Every document was copied, every copy was verified. The Duke had engaged the finest solicitor in London, not Grieve. Grieve was about to have a very bad evening, and had obtained warrants for the arrest of Dr. Calvert, the asylum keeper, and Mr. Grieve himself. The warrants would be executed simultaneously, at the same hour on the same evening, so that none of them could warn the others. The ball was held at Beaumont House in London, the Duke's Mayfair residence, a house so grand that receiving an invitation was itself a form of social currency. 300 guests. The cream of society, every family that mattered, every gossip, every columnist, every sharp-eyed dowager who would ensure that whatever happened in this room would be known across England by breakfast. Mrs. Moira Hadwell received her invitation 2 weeks in advance. It was addressed simply, "Mrs. Hadwell, Harrowfield, Devonshire." No mention of her niece, no mention of anything unusual, just a gilt-edged card from the Duke of Beaumont inviting her to a ball. She accepted immediately. An invitation from a duke was not something one refused. She had Arthur press his best coat. She had new gloves made. She practiced her curtsy. She had no idea what was waiting for her. Now, I will tell you something. I have written a great many stories for this channel, but what happens next, in this ballroom, in front of the most powerful people in England, is something I keep coming back to. Because it is not just revenge, it is resurrection, and the difference matters. The ballroom at Beaumont House blazed with candlelight, 600 candles in crystal chandeliers, the same number that had lit Almack's on the night the Duke first saw Nell 7 years ago. The orchestra played. The guests arrived in a steady stream of silk and velvet and diamonds that caught the light and threw it back in fractured rainbows. The champagne was French. The flowers were white roses. The Duke stood at the far end of the room. He was dressed in black. Black coat, black waistcoat, white cravat, the only Colour, the grey of his eyes, and the signet ring on his left hand. He looked, as he always looked, like a man who owned the room and everyone in it. Beside him, hidden from view by a silk screen, Nell waited. She was dressed in blue. Deep, midnight blue silk, the colour of a winter sky just before the stars appear. The dress was simple and exquisitely made, and it fit her properly. Not the shapeless asylum grey, not the too large travelling dress, but a gown cut for the body she now inhabited, which was still slender, but no longer gaunt, still pale, but no longer sallow. Her dark hair was pinned up with pearls. She wore a single diamond at her throat, the Beaumont diamond given to the wives of dukes for 3 generations. She was beautiful, not in the way that society defined beauty. She would never be the golden, dimpled debutante that London swooned over. She was beautiful the way a surviving thing is beautiful, with a gravity that came from having been destroyed and having rebuilt herself, brick by careful brick from the inside out. She was terrified. "I am here," the Duke said quietly beside her. "I will not leave your side. I know. If at any point you want to stop, if this is too much—" "It is not too much." Her voice was firm. "I survived that place. I can stand in a ballroom." At 9:10, Mrs. Moira Hadwell was announced. She swept into the room with the confidence of a woman who had gotten away with murder, because that is essentially what she believed she had done. She was dressed in purple, as always. Her face was powdered, her hair pinned, her smile fixed in place with the practiced ease of a woman who had turned grief into performance. She looked well. She looked prosperous. The Ashcroft estate had been generous to her. Arthur was behind her, tugging at his cravat, already eyeing the champagne. The Duke waited precisely 4 minutes, long enough for the Hadwells to settle, to accept a glass, to begin greeting acquaintances, long enough for them to feel comfortable. Then he stepped onto the dais at the head of the room, and the orchestra fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice carried without effort, filling the ballroom with the calm authority of a man who had rehearsed nothing because he needed none. "Thank you for joining me this evening. I have gathered you here for a particular reason, and I hope you will indulge me before the dancing begins." Every face in the room turned toward him. Many of you will remember that 7 years ago, in the spring of 1841, a young woman attended Almack's for her first and only season. Her name was Petronella Ashcroft, the only daughter of Sir Gerard Ashcroft. You may also remember that she died the following year of a sudden fever. She was 19 years old. A murmur rippled through the room. Mrs. Hadwell's smile froze. "I attended her funeral," the Duke continued. "I stood at the back of the church in Devonshire and watched them lower her coffin into the ground. I spoke to no one. I knew no one. I had met her once, briefly, and I had, for reasons I could not then explain, never forgotten her." His voice hardened. "3 months ago, I opened that coffin." The murmur became a gasp. "It was empty." Silence. Absolute, ringing silence. The entire ballroom holding its breath. Miss Ashcroft was not dead. She had never been dead. She was alive, locked in a private asylum in Yorkshire under a false name, committed there by the person who was supposed to protect her, the person who stood at her funeral and wept beautiful tears over an empty coffin, the person who claimed her inheritance the moment the last shovel of earth was in place. Every eye in the room turned, with the terrible precision of a compass, finding north toward Mrs. Moira Hadwell. The colour drained from her face. Not gradually. All at once, like water from a broken glass. Her champagne slipped from her fingers and shattered on the marble floor. Arthur made a sound. A high, thin sound. Thin and desperate. Miss Ashcroft survived 6 years of imprisonment. She survived being drugged, restrained, and told she was mad when she insisted she was who she said she was. She survived because she counted every day, 2,404 of them, and she refused to forget her own name. The Duke turned. He extended his hand toward the silk screen. "Ladies and gentlemen, I would like you to meet my wife, the Duchess of Beaumont." Nell stepped out. The entire room saw her. Every person who had attended her funeral, or known someone who had, or heard the story of the poor Ashcroft girl who died young. They saw her standing in blue silk with diamonds at her throat, and the steady, unbreakable gaze of a woman who had clawed her way back from the grave. Mrs. Hadwell screamed. It was not a word. It was not a recognizable sound. It was the noise a person makes when the foundation of their entire existence, every lie, every careful performance, every year of pretending, collapses beneath them in a single instant. "No," she said. "No, that is not. She is dead. She is standing in front of you." The Duke's voice was ice. "And you are going to stand in front of everyone you know and face what you did." Farrow stepped forward from the edge of the room. He was holding a leather portfolio. The Duke took it, opened it, and read aloud. Every document. The death certificate signed by Dr. Calvert, the asylum admission record for Mary Poole, the bank payments, the inheritance transfer, the solicitor's correspondence, item by item, piece by piece, the architecture of the crime laid bare before a ballroom full of witnesses. Arthur tried to run. He knocked over a waiter carrying a tray of champagne, sending crystal flutes shattering across the marble in an explosion of glass and wine. His face was the colour of old paper. His eyes were wild. He shouldered past a startled countess, stumbled over the hem of a dowager's gown, and made it perhaps 15 feet before a footman, positioned at the door by prior arrangement, broad-shouldered and entirely unmoved by the spectacle, stopped him with a hand on his chest and a look that suggested running would make things considerably worse. "Let me go," Arthur said. His voice cracked on every syllable. "I had nothing to do with it. It was Mother's idea, all of it. "You only spent the money," the Duke said from the dais. His voice carried across the room without effort. "You spent your cousin's inheritance at the card tables and the races while she rotted in a cell. Your debts were the reason your mother needed the estate. Your weakness was the engine of this entire crime." Arthur's legs gave out. He sagged against the footman, who held him upright with the dispassionate efficiency of a man preventing furniture from falling. The room had not moved. The room stood, frozen, champagne glasses suspended, mouths open, watching the most extraordinary scene any of them had ever witnessed. Lady Pemberton, the most formidable gossip in London, was gripping her companion's arm so tightly that she would later find bruises. Lord Ashton, the Duke's oldest friend, was standing by the orchestra with tears running down his face and making no effort whatsoever to wipe them away. Dr. Calvert was arrested this evening at his home in Harley Street, the Duke said. Mr. Grieve was arrested at his chambers in Lincoln's Inn. The keeper of Briarstone Asylum has been taken into custody by the Yorkshire magistrate. Warrants have been issued for the arrest of Mrs. Moira Hadwell and Mr. Arthur Hadwell on charges of fraud, false imprisonment, and conspiracy. 2 magistrates' officers stepped into the ballroom. The crowd parted to let them through. The silence was so complete that Nell could hear the click of their boot heels on the marble floor. Mrs. Hadwell looked at her niece. Across the ballroom, the same distance that had separated Nell and the Duke at Almack's all those years ago. 60 feet of candle-lit space between the woman who had buried her alive and the woman who had refused to stay buried. "You were nothing," Mrs. Hadwell said. Her voice was a hiss. "You were a plain, quiet nothing, and you should have stayed. She is the Duchess of Beaumont." The Duke's voice cut across hers, final, absolute. And you are finished. The officers took her arms. Arthur was led out behind her, blubbering, his cravat askew. The doors closed behind them. The ballroom erupted, not with panic, with something more complex, a wave of sound that was part shock, part fury, part something almost like relief, because every person in that room who had ever attended a funeral and felt that something was not quite right, every woman who had ever feared the power a guardian held over her, every mother who had ever looked at her daughter and thought, what if? They felt it. The story landed in their bones. Lady Pemberton was the first to move. She crossed the ballroom floor, her silk skirts swishing against the marble, and she stopped in front of Nell. She was 73 years old. She had ruled London society for 4 decades. She had never bowed to anyone who was not royalty. She curtsied. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice carried across the room with the authority of a woman who understood that what she did next would set the tone for every drawing-room in England. "Welcome back." One by one they followed. The curtsies, the bows, the murmured "Your Grace" from people who had once walked past the girl by the pillar without a second glance. The room reformed itself around Nell, not with the false warmth of people who were covering their embarrassment, but with the genuine, shaken recognition that they were in the presence of someone who had survived something they could not imagine. The Duchess of Beaumont received them all. She stood beside her husband, and she shook every hand and accepted every curtsy, and she held back every tear. Not even when an elderly baronet who had known her father pressed her hand between both of his and said, his voice breaking, "Gerard would be so proud of you, child." She held. She had been holding for years. She could hold for one more evening. Later, in the quiet hours after midnight, after the guests had gone and the candles had burned low and the ballroom was empty except for the faint smell of champagne and roses, the Duke found Nell standing at the window of his study. The blue dress still caught the low light. The diamond still glittered at her throat. She was holding the card, the old one, the blank one, the one he had alive the entire time. Her voice was 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 alive the entire entire time. Her voice was alive the 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 entire time. Her voice alive the entire time. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright. She put roses in my coffin, my father's roses, the roses he planted the year I was born. She took something beautiful and used it to make the lie convincing. That is the part I cannot forgive. You do not have to forgive it. You have to outlive it. She was quiet for a moment. Then, what will happen to her? Your aunt will stand trial. The evidence is incontestable. She will not see the inside of a drawing room again. If the court is merciful, she will spend her remaining years in a place not unlike the one she sent you to. Though I am told the accommodations in Newgate are considerably less comfortable than Briarstone. He paused. Arthur will likely be transported. He has neither the wit nor the fortitude to survive a trial. And Dr. Calvert? Struck from the medical register this morning. Arrested this evening. He will lose everything. She nodded. Then, quietly, there was a woman at Briarstone, an attendant. Her name was Ruth. She was kind to me. She brought me extra blankets. She said my name when no one else would. Her voice dropped. She has 3 children. The youngest was 4 when I arrived. She would be 10 now. I will find her, the Duke said. I will ensure she and her children want for nothing. A cottage, near here, where she can see the sky. Done. She turned from the window. She turned to face him. This man who had watched her across a ballroom and waited all those years and opened a coffin and ridden through the night and filled a dance card with her name 12 times and held her while she wept and married her in a quiet chapel and stood before all of London society and said, "She is my wife." "Dance with me," she said. "There is no music." "I do not care." He took her hand. He put his other hand on her waist. She rested her fingers on his shoulder, and in the silence of the study, in the last glow of the fire, they danced. No orchestra, no audience, no candlelight, except the dying embers. Just the 2 of them, turning slowly in the dark, filling in the blank lines on a dance card that had been waiting all this time. "You kept this," she whispered, holding up the card. "I kept everything." And that, my friends, is the story of Nell Ashcroft and the Duke of Beaumont. A story about a girl who was erased and a man who refused to let her stay forgotten. If this story moved you, I want to hear from you. Tell me your favorite moment. Tell me where in the world you are listening from. Tell me if you are still thinking about that empty coffin, or the blank dance card, or the moment she stepped out from behind the screen and 300 people saw a ghost who was not a ghost at all. Thank you for being here. Every one of you. If you have not subscribed yet, join us. I will see you in the next one.